Hello and welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International. This is Robert L.D. Cooper with Mark A. Tabbert. We are Magi. Our mission is to promote the highest standards in education, research and publications relating to the global phenomenon of Freemasonry.
Welcome to the Masonic Authors Guild International's podcast, The Wide Masonic World. Hello, I'm Magi Mark A. Tabbert with Magi Robert L.D. Cooper. Christopher L. Kolakowski is director of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, a position he has held since January 6, 2020. He was born and raised in Fredericksburg, Virginia, but his mother's family has very deep roots in the Badger State. Chris received his BA in History and Mass Communications from Emory and Henry College and his master's in public history from the State University of New York at Albany. Chris has spent his career interpreting and preserving American military history with the National Park Service, New York State Government, the Rensselaer County, New York Historical Society, the Civil War Preservation Trust, the Kentucky State Parks, and the U.S. Army. Between 2013 and 2020, he was the executive director of the Douglas MacArthur Memorial in Norfolk, Virginia. He has written and spoken extensively on various aspects of the military, history, and leadership from 1775 to the present, and was the inaugural director of the General George Patton Museum and Center of Leadership at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Chris has published 3 books on the Civil War and 3 on World War II in the Pacific. He is a reviewer and contributor to the Air Force Journal of Indo-Pacific Affairs and a senior fellow at the Consortium of Indo-Pacific Researchers. His latest book, titled 10th Army Commander, is about General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., who was killed in the battle on Okinawa. Lastly, Chris is a past master of Landmark Lodge number 41 in Versailles, Kentucky, serving in the East in 2008. Today, we will begin our discussion with his paper on Arthur and Douglas MacArthur, Men and Masons, but we'll move on to larger questions on the military and Freemasonry and famous Freemasons. Welcome, Brother Chris.
Thanks for having me.
So just so there's no hint of duplicity, I invited Brother Chris for a Magi paper and interview because of my deep interest, or some might suggest unhealthy reverence, for General Douglas MacArthur and his father, Arthur MacArthur. I've known Chris for several years, and I decided a lighter, more philosophical discussion is a good change from the deeper, more obscure topics we've recently addressed with such folks as Sam Biagiotti and Natalie Bayer. Here's my first question for Chris. Just to avoid confusion between the two General MacArthurs, please explain why it is typical to refer to them as the elder and the younger MacArthur.
So that actually was what the Filipinos did. And it's kind of been adopted by a lot of MacArthur historians since. I do it myself. Arthur MacArthur is the father, Arthur MacArthur the second, and then his son Douglas. Arthur MacArthur serves in the Philippines and is one of the senior American commanders during the Philippine War in the early 20th century. And so for that generation of Filipinos, that's General MacArthur. And so when his son Douglas comes to the Philippines first as a brigadier general in the 1920s, having served as well before then, in the Philippines, and then comes back to command and be military advisor to the Philippine Commonwealth government, there's another General MacArthur. And so it becomes, kind of like Moltke the Elder and Moltke the Younger in the German army. It becomes MacArthur the Elder and MacArthur the Younger, because they're both General MacArthur. And nobody's calling them Arthur or Art and Douglas or Doug. It's General MacArthur, and then it's that way you know which one's which.
So that the other side of that is, as far as I know, the only person who ever had the courage to call Douglas MacArthur Douglas was President Franklin Roosevelt. Everybody else called him General. Is that correct?
That is true. There are a couple of exceptions for 42nd Division guys that served with MacArthur in World War I. They'll call him Doug in some of their personal correspondence, but in public, it's Douglas or General MacArthur. There's a certain formality there for sure.
Yeah, there are very few men like that, and I know that the famous baseball manager, player, and general manager Branch Rickey, who everybody called Mr. Rickey because he was such a revered personality. So anyway, here's my last bit, and then we'll let Bob get in on this. As an 18-year-old boy and son of a well-connected judge, Arthur MacArthur was commissioned a lieutenant in the 24th Wisconsin Regiment in 1861 at the start of the Civil War. Could you please explain why Arthur and so many other young affluent men joined up for that fight in 1861? What was motivating the younger generation?
So in short, it was, think about where we are in the 19th century. In that time, in the middle part of the 19th century, the United States has 34, by the end of the Civil War, to be 34 states. I think it's 31 or 32 in 1861. So it's still a growing, developing nation. Wisconsin has only been a state, and he's enlisting from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Wisconsin's only been a state since 1848. And so you get a lot of in particularly the western states, you get this idea that, hey, we're now part of the country. This is our opportunity to do our bit. There's also the flag was fired upon at Fort Sumter by the Confederacy. And if the flag is attacked, we are going to preserve the Union. We are going to repel the attack, as it were, speaking very, very broadly. And then let's be honest, he's an 18-year-old kid. War is an adventure. And so there's a certain sense of that as well. And because of who his father is, he doesn't go into the ranks as a private. He goes into the ranks as a lieutenant and adjutant of that regiment. And coincidentally, he earns the Medal of Honor for leadership under fire in 1863, carrying a flag up Missionary Ridge outside of Chattanooga. And if you want to view that flag, we have it in the collections of the Wisconsin Veterans Museum.
A reason to go and visit you, absolutely.
Absolutely, yeah.
Thanks very much for coming along today and talking to us. One of the most striking things about high-profile people, not just military people, but high-profile people who were Freemasons, very few of them actually ever said anything about what Freemasonry meant to them personally. So my question is to you is, during the various research projects that you've undertaken regarding the MacArthur family, have you come across anyone in the military in particular who ever expressed an opinion about Freemasonry? And if they haven't, or if you've never found any information, why do you think that's the case?
That's a great question, and I think it operates on the answer operates on a couple of levels. One of the very few people that I've actually seen address Freemasonry is Douglas MacArthur. And that's why I take the time to quote in my paper what I do, his thoughts about the craft. For a lot of these guys, I think it's a combination of, sometimes I'm not sure the biographer really understands the importance of being a Mason for some of these folks. For example, somebody like George Marshall, who becomes a Mason at sight a week after Pearl Harbor. What does that mean? The fact that he, at that time, takes the opportunity to attend Federal Lodge number 1 in D.C. and become a Mason at sight. And so if you're not in the craft, you may not fully appreciate what that means. And so I think there's a piece of interpretation there. But the other thing I would suggest to all of our listeners who are brothers, I'm not sure I can explain exactly what Freemasonry means to me. I can define what the fraternity is. I can define what it stands for. I can talk to prospective brothers about it. But when you ask me what it means to me, it joining the craft did something and means something to me that is very difficult to put into words. And they talk about how, when you join the craft, it takes good men and makes them better. That process of making you better sometimes is so personal and it's so undefinable that it is difficult to articulate. And so I would, others' mileage may vary. Other people may have other perspectives, but I would suggest those things probably play into why the military Masons, you don't hear a lot of commentary about it from them.
Yeah,
would agree.
I agree with you on that. It's a very personal, and quite often quite an intense experience. And, without knowing what anybody else thinks about it, you don't really have a context to
Right.
express your own feelings about it. So, yeah, I just wanted to get an idea of, what, from your perspective, that's the same, I think, pretty much across the world.
So, Chris, it's understandable that MacArthur Sr. did not join Freemasonry until he was stationed in Arkansas and a more a bit settled with his family and established in his career. So he joined Freemasonry in Arkansas in 1880. But do you have any ideas as to why MacArthur the Younger waited to join the craft until he had retired from the United States Army, having finished his career as Chief of Staff, and then came to the Philippines to serve as military advisor in 1936?
Honestly, I think part of it is he was too busy. It's notable, by the way, that when MacArthur the Younger, when Douglas becomes a Freemason, he becomes a Mason at sight in Manila Lodge #1 in the Philippines. So think about what it takes to join. If he was to join, let's say, a lot of military Masons end up joining the lodge around West Point. During their cadet period, or they join at another post, things like that. The ritual work, if you at the absolute fastest that you can do it, is usually about 90 days. If that's the fastest, and it's a lot of memory work. I mean, I don't need to explain that. It's an involved process, and that's just the degrees. That doesn't count the petitioning and all this stuff. So it could be 6 to 12 months. When you look back at the span of his career, find me 6 to 12 months where he has the time to devote to this. And I honestly, I think that's the same reason why it takes George Marshall until 1941, and he and MacArthur are virtually the same age. And so I think there's a piece to that, that they're just so active, they're so committed, and when the opportunity presents itself to become a Mason at sight, this is what I'm going to do. Had that opportunity not presented itself, I'm not sure Douglas MacArthur might have joined. Or if he did, he probably wouldn't have joined until after Truman fired him in 1951.
Well, first of all, George Marshall's father was very active in Freemasonry in Pennsylvania. And so you could see Marshall not having the time to be Freemason, but do something and to remember his father.
Right.
And then, I also wonder if MacArthur joined in part because he was very, very close with all his Filipino friends. And maybe that he was, in many ways, closer to the Filipinos than he was to a lot of Americans, I suppose, in some ways. And that,
he and Manuel Quezon were lodge brothers, but they also called each other muchachos.
Yeah.
And Quezon was godfather to Douglas's son, Arthur IV.
Yeah.
So that just to prove that proves your point right there.
Yeah. The last thing I have to say, because this is one of my favorite stories, because I witnessed it myself. So about 2004, I was at a lodge in Massachusetts to give a talk, and it was a Masonic anniversary, and a man stood up, and it was, I guess, his 60th Masonic anniversary. But anyway, he joined in 1944, and he told the story that he was a sailor on a Jeep carrier going in San Francisco, and they were back in port for repairs, and he got a 10-day or 15-day pass, and he flew all the way back to Massachusetts. His father picked him up at the airport. They took him directly to a lodge. They gave him the first degree. He had to stay up all night memorizing. He received the second degree. He had to stay up all night memorizing. He received the third degree and was raised a Master Mason. They put him back on the plane, and he flew back to San Francisco and got on his Jeep carrier to go off to the Pacific.
Oh, wow.
When he was underway in the Pacific, and this is like going to the Philippines, going who knows where, there was a meeting of Freemasons on board in the dispensary area or in the surgery area. And he went to this meeting, and it's just Masons from all over the country. They're not doing degree work, of course, but it's just a friendly meeting club. And in the midst of that meeting, the captain of the ship shows up, right? So the captain is a Freemason. So,
Wow.
so this man, as he's telling the story, realized that his father had written a letter to the captain and asked for a special Masonic favor so that his son could be made a Mason before he went off, into the war, right? So that the captain had done a favor for a Masonic favor to the son, to the father, which is a great story. Yeah,
Yeah, really it is.
Anyway, where are we at? Oh, so it's Bob, it's your turn. Sorry.